Welcome to the Finance Files, a podcast hosted by best friends Whitney Coford, yours truly, and Brittany Carter, with occasional guests, including my dad, Greg Coford.
We talk about all things finance, including investing, trading, economics, capital markets, and business management. Learn the investor mindset with us.
As a disclaimer, this podcast is not investment advice. It is purely for entertainment purposes. And as a reminder, please make sure to do your own research, which perfectly leads into our theme for the week, how to do your own research. So, Britt, where do you think we should start?
I mean, I think we're trying to figure out, because Fundamental Fridays is really about applying it and not just passively hearing this podcast and moving on with your life. And so I think one thing that is really important to think about is, where are you getting your information and how are you analyzing it? So I think too, just personally, I don't I do have like New York Times subscription, and occasionally like we'll read articles and things like that, but I actually don't spend a lot of time on a daily basis reading the news. Like, for example, I just voted yesterday, and what I did is, the day of voting, I really haven't followed everything super closely. The day of voting, I looked up every single candidate. It takes a while, but I vote both sides. Like, I want to see what the candidate wants to bring to the table. I did all my research then, so I just allocate a huge chunk of my day on voting day to learning about the issue and knocking it out then, rather than like going over the course of however many days. So that's how I personally like to make some of my decisions. And I think, like, when I am looking at companies or things like that as well, I'd rather just do it all at once and kind of do it all in a chunk and look at it comprehensively to get the big picture when I'm making a decision, rather than like some offshoot, perpetual, consistent analysis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like a snapshot method, right? You're taking a snapshot of what is happening right now in this moment and what do these different candidates believe. And I think I'm with you currently. When I was doing my MBA especially, I would read the news religiously. Like, I would spend an hour every morning reading articles from many different sources. And what I noticed is, one, it negatively affected my mental health, because there are so many problems in the world, and news is designed, I mean, going back to talking about what's like, why are companies doing what they're doing? Well, the purpose of news is to get eyeballs on the news. And humans are drawn to the negative. So most headlines are going to be negative, and they're going to focus on the negatives rather than the positives. So after like a year or so of reading the news pretty religiously, I realized, like, this is actually negatively affecting my mental health. So I no longer read the news religiously every single morning. I will occasionally scan headlines just to see what's going on. But it's a balance, I think, of paying attention to current events, but also I'm with you on, as far as voting goes. I'm just going to look at it, at the time that I'm going to vote, do the research on each individual candidate. I typically end up voting for a mix of parties. I don't vote single party, because I just look at each candidate individually and try to pick the one that aligns the most with my points of view. And you're never going to have a candidate that aligns 100%, unfortunately. But I try to find kind of middle of the road on that. And same thing when I'm looking at a company. The place that I start when I'm looking at a company is I look at, like, what's my first impression? So how do they market themselves? How do they present themselves? Is their information understandable? Are they telling a good story? And then I'll dig into the numbers on the financials. If they have an analyst report, I'll look through that. That's usually a really good summary. But again, you got to take it with a grain of salt because what's right, an analyst, their job is probably going to be, sell the stock, right? Get people to buy. And so you have to keep that in mind when you're reading any sort of report. And then companies obviously are going to try to present themselves in the best light. So that's why it's important to do industry research is understand what's the big picture and why is this particular company and the work they're doing important and how could it potentially impact the future. So, but I agree. Reading the news every day, man, I can't do it.
I know I tried looking up the study, but of course I can't find it. But statistically speaking, you're more likely to have a bad day after reading the news. And we're not saying don't be informed, guys. Don't take that as the takeaway. But like, I think there's something to be said, and there's a lot of people that I've heard subscribe to this. Like, I think Tim Ferriss has like publicly come with this. Is like, you need to think about like what's in your circle of control and what's outside your circle of control. Like, I really try to focus on like what are the action items rather than just ingesting news for the sake of being quote unquote informed.
Right. Well, and I think going back to your point about what's your source and where are you getting the news, even there, I mean, even sources that seem like they could be reputable, right, may not be. So, for example, Fox News, they were part of a lawsuit last year for defamation and being accused of spreading literal fake news, and they ended up settling for like $780 million. And as part of their defense, and this is why we make this reference in our disclaimer, their defense was, well, we're not a news outlet, we're an entertainment outlet. And so it's like they admitted in a legal court proceeding that they are not news, they are for entertainment, which means that although that they're called Fox News and a lot of people rely on them for news, they've admitted that's not their purpose and that's not what they're doing. And so you really have, so even something that may have once been reputable, right, that can change over time.
Well, and I think too, just to slam some other news, so make people not think that we're, not partial.
Right.
Like
We're not biased.
CNN, I was like in class and they're like, oh, they didn't even get like we were reading this article and our French teacher was like, these people are idiots. They didn't even put the like term length of the French president in properly. It was like the wrong term length. Like news outlets make mistakes all the time.
Right.
I mean, my stuff got quoted in like Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and like sometimes like I was working off a previous analyst's report, and like I kind of knew those numbers were probably not them, but there was a bit of a precedent. If you don't have something to actively oppose those numbers, you keep them, what have you. So like you need to realize like even like the biggest papers, even the biggest news outlets, like there's always going to be some degree of error, and you need to be using, critical thinking to make your decision.
Yeah, and I think look at multiple sources too. Like one of my favorite kind of sources for news, like I like looking at news aggregators because basically what they do is they pull in a bunch of different articles from different sources. And so when you're looking at a news aggregator, you're getting kind of a mix of sources, and so then it's, it's that old adage of truth is always going to be truth. And so if everyone is, well, and this is probably not always true, but if the majority is saying this is the truth, then it's more likely, right, that is the case.
I love looking at opposing views and
Yes.
figuring out where they're right, right? Because sometimes it's just a matter of perspective. Like if
Right.
they're looking at it, oh, pet cam
Sorry, the
activated.
dogs feel very strongly about this. They're like, do your research.
Do your research. But yeah, and don't. It's funny. There's this thing that says like politics and religion in particular, like your brain just goes into like shut off mode. Like take time to be open. One of my favorite things is talking to my stepdad about politics because he tends, like, I would say I lean more Democrat, but I do vote Republican sometimes. He is like definitely more on the Republican side like I think it's important to just kind of like get other perspectives and see where they're valid. Because it might be that you still end up making the same decision, but you want to have every single opinion.
I completely agree. I think it's really hard. Like, I think as humans, we have an innate need to be right. And it's so much easier when things are in black and white, but the world is very rarely black and white. So you have to look at multiple sources, multiple points of view, and assimilate all that to form your own decision. And then I think you also have to be open to changing your opinion as you're gathering more information. And that, as an investor, can be really hard to do, right? If you've invested in a company, it can be hard to objectively look at its progress and what's happening and the macro factors and acknowledge, hey, my thesis has changed. It's no longer correct. And it's hard to admit when we're wrong. So I think another important thing is to just continually, like you said, be open and reevaluate periodically.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I think too, just in terms of what cadence you look, like that also goes into like if you're a day trader, you need to look every day.
Mm-hmm.
But, if you are a long-term investor, maybe you're looking at this and this depends on the volatility of your market as well. Is this like something you want to look at on a monthly basis, a quarterly basis? Like figure out what cadence makes sense for you. I tend to personally invest in things where I feel like there's a long-term game at play. So I really don't have to like, and most of my stuff's in index funds anyways, so I don't have to look at my portfolio that frequently, right? And then like I said, I just try to make all those decisions at one time, like all at once, where I'm getting historicals, I'm getting like future projections, I'm looking at the industry as a whole because that's just the way I work. But teach their own.
All right. So I think this is a good kind of end point for the week. So to wrap it up, pay attention to your sources, pay attention to the background of the sources and the individuals for the information you're looking at. You can look at, do they update, do they retract, look at differing opinions, both sides. What is their motivation? It's probably usually going to be money or power. So take a look at that and take that into consideration, whether there's a conflict of interest. There's so many ways to suss out what may or may not be fake news versus reputable news and information. And you have to take all of that into account when doing your research. Anything you want to add, Britt, or that I
Well,
missed?
I think you summed it up great. So, on that note, thank you so much for tuning in this week to the Finance Files. We will see you next week.